Welcome, everyone. My name is Tom Kemeny. I'm a professor here at the Munk School and a member of the Innovation Policy Lab. I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker, Margaret O'Meara, the final speaker of the year in our Innovation Policy Lab seminar series for this academic year. Margaret is the Scott and Dorothy Bullitt Chair and Professor of American History at the University of Washington. She is a leading historian of Silicon Valley and the author of 2 acclaimed books about the modern American technology industry, The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America, and Cities of Knowledge, Cold War Science and the Search for the Next Silicon Valley. She's also a historian of the American presidency and author of Pivotal Tuesdays, 4 Elections That Shaped the 20th Century. And of course, in addition to her many academic contributions, her writing has appeared in many leading journalistic outlets, New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, and the list goes on. I think we're in for a real treat this afternoon on a topic that's in the top of many of our minds right now amidst all that's happening to the South. Like many of you, I'm sure I've been fascinated by the new or maybe only visibly new role played by key Silicon Valley actors in the political space. And I think, Margaret is really well poised in this combination of expertise on Silicon Valley and also expertise about the American political system to put those two together in her talk today. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Please join me in welcoming Margaret O'Meara.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you everyone at the Munk School for hosting me. And this is just a delight to be here. And on this beautiful sunny day coming from Seattle, I appreciate the vitamin D and the lovely early spring weather. So thank you all for showing up. We are indeed in an extraordinary moment in world history and American history. There is a convergence of tech power and political power, quite literally, in the Oval Office, that really places the United States and the world in uncharted waters. Elon Musk has the leading Doge, our special government employee in the United States, doing what he calls wielding a chainsaw for bureaucracy, and promising $2 trillion in savings. Never mind the discretionary budget of the United States totals about 2.2 trillion in savings. The discretionary budget of the US is about $1.8 trillion. So I don't quite know where the extra savings are coming. We already have a lot of opacity and exaggeration in terms of what cuts have been affected so far, but nonetheless, the chainsaw is certainly doing its work and hacking away at the federal government, reflecting an attitude that very little about it is worth saving. Destroy it all and then build in something new. This is an extreme manifestation of a way of thinking about the US government that has been prevailing in Silicon Valley, in some Silicon Valley circles for quite some time, that posits the innovative miracle that is the American technology industry as something that has been against government, the antithesis of government, something that the US government had nothing to do with. And we see this manifested in the words and the writings of leading investors and entrepreneurs like Marc Andreessen, who's was a co-founder of Netscape. If you guys remember Netscape, the original web browser from the early 1990s, the dot-com era, now the co-founder of Andreessen Horowitz, one of the major important venture capital firms of the 21st century. And this is a techno-optimist manifesto of some 5,000 words that Andreessen published on Andreessen Horowitz website 2 years ago, which among other things talks about markets and praises markets, free markets. We believe free markets are the most effective way to organize a technological economy. Willing buyer meets willing seller. Price is struck. Both sides benefit from the exchange, or it doesn't happen. Profits are the incentive for producing supply that fulfills demand. Prices encode information about supply and demand. Markets cause entrepreneurs to seek out high prices as a signal of opportunity to create new wealth by driving those prices down. We believe the market economy is a discovery machine, a form of intelligence, an exploratory, evolutionary, adaptive system. The government, the state, has no place in this market. The market is free. This freedom from states, from institutions, from the rules, is something that I think those of you in Toronto witnessed firsthand when Google attempted to redevelop the waterfront, initially in kind of a fantastical fashion. This is this is an excerpt from a very good book called Sideways by Josh O'Kane, who's a financial reporter here in Toronto, about that whole exploit. And it was Sidewalk Labs, you might remember. Some in the room and online may remember this. But this idea, the kind of techno-utopianism, we're going to reinvent a city, we're going to reinvent space, we're going to reinvent government. And in order to do that, we're not going to adhere to any of the existing rules or institutions. And as Google and Sidewalk Labs discovered in its experience in Toronto, that you actually cannot just go into a major world city and reinvent it from scratch, that there are things that are already on the ground, including people that have opinions and political structures. So this type of thinking is something that indeed has been a secret to the American technology industry. It has powered all sorts of innovations. I talk often about an admiring fashion about the supercomputer I have on my wrist. Several of you in the room may have some of them too. You certainly have supercomputers in your pocket. And we are, collectively in this room, there's more computing power than the entire US space program had in the 1960s. It is extraordinary. And yet, that is an engineering triumph and is not necessarily something that transits over into other realms of politics, society, and the economy. So my most recent book, The Code, was a history of Silicon Valley that very much put politics back into the story. When I was first working on the research for this book about a little more than 10 years ago, I remember talking to someone who'd been around the Valley for a very, very long time. And I explained to him that I was writing a history of Silicon Valley, a one-volume history, and that in some ways it was going to be a political history of the Valley and talk a lot about the relationship between politics and policy in the American context. And he said, can I tell you something, just author to author, because he'd published some very well-received business books as well. And I said, yes. And he said, I fear that's going to remain on the remainder table, that no one's going to buy it, because there's no story there. There's no connection between Silicon Valley and the US government. And certainly in his mind, as someone who had been part of this entrepreneurial economy for 4 decades, he really did not see the presence of the state in what companies like Apple and Microsoft and the other big tech platforms have been able to do. But the history of the Valley is very connected to the history of the United States government. And so too, the United States government and US politics has been shaped by the leaders and the companies of Silicon Valley. And even though Silicon Valley and the American tech industry is all about building the future, that indeed the product of history, it is very much a product of history, that this past actually does shape the present and does indicate what is possible for the future. And so that's where a historian like me comes in. So today I want to talk about this talk is going to have 4 main parts of our journey here. I'm going to talk about the big government roots of Silicon Valley and talk in particular about 2 iconic early Silicon Valley companies, Hewlett-Packard and Fairchild Semiconductor, and how this big government story actually plays into their creation and development in ways that might surprise you. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the anti-government culture of Silicon Valley that sees itself, as Andreessen presents, as a creature of markets, as a free market triumph, as something that where, as Elon Musk sees it, the government is the enemy to technological progress. And so where that comes from and why. And then the third, I'm going to talk about the not so secret history of high-tech lobbying, how Silicon Valley companies and leaders have lobbied Washington, D.C. in particular. They've also lobbied state capitals, but I'm going to be talking mostly about US national politics and presidential politics in particular, and how what we're seeing today actually does have a longer history, even though its manifestation is of a form and a sort that is distinctive and unique. And then last, I'm going to be talking about how we did get to now with the supersizing of Silicon Valley itself, the extraordinary growth of a few platform companies and the growth of the fortunes of the people who are atop those companies, an extraordinary concentration of power and wealth that helps us understand the political economy of 2025. So the big government roots. So the history of Silicon Valley is often understood to start in this garage. It kind of starts lots of different places and other places, but let's start with this particular garage, which in 1939 was the place that Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett, two recent graduates of Stanford University, founded Hewlett-Packard, which is now known as HP. This was really the first and most famous homegrown startup that began near Stanford, founded by Stanford graduates. It wasn't the only one. There were a number of other recent engineering graduates of Stanford that founded companies. And certainly it wasn't the only garage startup in the United States. In fact, all over the United States and all over Canada, for that matter, the early 20th century was full of young men in garages building things. And so this was not something that was, showed that Silicon Valley was destined to be a high-tech capital. The thing that really set Silicon Valley and put it on the map and turned it into a hub of electronics was military spending. During the Second World War, the California and the Bay Area became a hub of military spending and military activity for the Pacific Theater that continued into the 1950s and 1960s. That there was a great deal of military spending concentrated in the Bay Area, and particularly spending on aerospace and advanced electronics and communication devices in the South Bay, the 40 miles south of San Francisco, where Stanford University is located, in this warm, dry, flat climate that was perfect for airfields and flying airplanes, among other things. Hewlett-Packard story is a great example of a story that, again, is the iconic garage startup that is presented as this entrepreneurial miracle, not understood as a defense contractor per se, but the defense business was actually integral to its survival as a startup. In the 1940s, when it was only a few years old, wartime contracts kept the business going. One of its founders, co-founders, Bill Hewlett, actually went into the military, but his partner, David Packard, was allowed an exemption to stay running the company because Hewlett-Packard was doing so much important military work, manufacturing electronics. This contracting continued through Hewlett-Packard's early decades as it grew and had a significant commercial book of business. Among other things, does anyone remember the Walt Disney movie Fantasia? You've seen Fantasia? Well, the oscillators, the sound that provided the surround sound, then innovative surround sound for Fantasia in the movie theaters in the 1940s, were manufactured by Hewlett-Packard. HP loves to talk about the Walt Disney contract as this got its start, but actually that was contemporaneous with all these military contracts, and those continued. In fact, HP was such an important defense contractor and had done so much work with the Pentagon that when Richard Nixon was elected president in 1968, he appointed David Packard as his Deputy Secretary of Defense because of Packard's familiarity with the Pentagon. It should be noted, as a sort of a contrast to the current moment, when Elon Musk does not seem to have renounced any of his interests in his ongoing businesses while he does Doge, nor have other Trump appointees stepped away from the day-to-day management of some of their other interests. Packard, who was a very rich man by that point, put his entire fortune into a blind trust for the duration of his time in government. Times have changed. But there is this tight connection that was there from the start. And that's something to keep in mind as when we think about the free market miracle that is Silicon Valley. This is not to mean that Hewlett and Packard were big fans of big government. Oh, no, not in the least. They were Republicans. In fact, David Packard was a very, very active Republican. He was not a social conservative of the same sort as Ronald Reagan, but he was a fiscal conservative. He deeply, deeply disliked and was alarmed by the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson and had much to say about it. And he also was a very close friend and ally of former President Herbert Hoover, who after his defeat by Franklin Roosevelt in the 1932 election, retired to Stanford, where he had been an undergraduate. Hoover was a member of Stanford's very first undergraduate class. and lived a very long life. Hoover lived into the early 1960s. And over those 3 decades of retirement became increasingly more conservative, and in fact was a really important voice in shaping the modern Republican conservative movement. And David Packard was someone who shared a lot of his small government sentiment, despite having a lot of business with the Pentagon. Hewlett-Packard also had a politics that carried over into the way it ran its company that was very influential in the way that subsequent Silicon Valley companies grew, not least because HP was a very large employer, perhaps one of the largest employers in the Valley in the 1950s and 60s. So a lot of people who went on to found other companies worked at Hewlett-Packard first. Hewlett-Packard was a place that Packard, at one point when Packard was asked, people said, people asked me, are we just about making money? And no, in fact, we are not just about making money. We have to go deeper to find reasons for why we're here. This idea of a mission-driven company, a company that was also a family, not a hierarchy, was something that was embedded in what Hewlett and Packard called the HP way. Every year there'd be an all company-wide picnic, and the two bosses would flip burgers and everyone would line up and get served by them. This is something that, in 1950s corporate America was highly unusual. So too was it unusual to have the two leaders of the company, founders of the company, rather than sitting in corner offices in their coat and tie, they'd instead take off their jackets and walk around the floor of the shop floor. They called it management by walking around, just to see what everyone was doing. So this non-hierarchical, more mission-driven model was something that other subsequent companies pick up. It also was one that was fiercely anti-union. Both Hewlett and Packard saw the presence of labor unions as a sign that you were doing management wrong. So they were very much kind of going against the grain of the prevailing corporate organization of mid-20th century North America, which was quite different than what they're practicing. So I bring all this in because this is a company that was very important economically to the story of Silicon Valley. It's very important in kind of framing this idea of what a company should be, what good management was like. And also, despite having so much business with the federal government and the Defense Department, not all of its business, but a good deal of it, and having close relationships with politicians like Herbert Hoover and others, saw itself as outside the state, saw itself as something that was doing things better than these big bureaucratic institutions, whether they be government or business or labor unions. And that is something that has, again, these ideas that are circulating today and shaping the present day politics, US politics and big tech relationship have very, very deep roots. Here's a second big government story that you might not expect. This is the story of Fairchild Semiconductor. This is known as the original venture-backed startup. This is the first silicon semiconductor startup that then gave birth to so many others. It was founded by 8 engineers who had come west to work for William Shockley, the co-inventor of the transistor. Shockley proved to be, among other things, a terrible boss. They all quit en masse in 1956-57. Which, mind you, you did not do then. You did not set off and try to found your own company, particularly if you were young engineers without money or connections, which all of them were at that point. But those 8 men went on to include the co-inventor of the transistor, Robert Noyce, who was also a co-founder of Intel, and also Eugene Kleiner, who was a co-founder of one of the major venture capital firms in Silicon Valley, Kleiner Perkins, and others and others. It is seen as kind of the original startup that brought the silicon to Silicon Valley. And it holds legendary status as this model for how you build a venture-backed private sector startup. But Fairchild Semiconductor is founded in the fall of 1957. And here's a great example of lucky timing, because a month after it's founded informally in September 1957, the Soviet Union sends the Sputnik satellite up into orbit, beating the United States into space, and setting off this massive space race, this rush to spend money on advanced electronics and communication devices, exactly what Fairchild Semiconductor is making. And this goes into further overdrive in the early 1960s when John Kennedy declares we shall reach the moon by the end of this decade. Here he is with Wernher von Braun, the former German rocket scientist who is repatriated to the United States and is an architect of the U.S. Space program. Again, another government connection with high technology, international. And that is something that really, just as wartime contracts kept Hewlett-Packard in business in the 1940s, the orders from NASA, particularly for integrated circuits, microchip technology, for the Apollo program to send a man to the moon, keep Fairchild Semiconductor and other chip makers in business and help build a vital chip industry. And by ordering so much of these very expensive, very refined products, for which there is no commercial market in the early 1960s, they drive down the cost of production, enable these companies to scale up and to commercialize. And by the end of the 1960s, you have two people of the Traders' Eight. Here in the middle is Bob Noyce, and next to him is, in the glasses, is Gordon Moore. You may have heard of Moore's Law. That's that Moore. And also Andy Grove, like so many people integral to the story of Silicon Valley and American technology, an immigrant, a foreign-born. He's a refugee from communist Hungary who arrives in the United States without a college degree, speaking very little English in the late 1950s. And he goes on to become one of the most legendary leaders in Silicon Valley history. He is one of many immigrant stories that just underscores how the current U.S. policy is the biggest, one of the many own goals that we are currently making in terms of discouraging for future American innovation. So two startup stories that become a little more complicated when we bring the government in. And I'm not saying, okay, don't give these entrepreneurs any credit. I'm saying that entrepreneurship and government funding coexist, that the American story is one where the two are intertwined and you cannot separate them out. The government is a customer, it is a funder of research, it is an investor in human capital. But it does so in the American context in a way that is highly privatized and allows companies like Fairchild Semiconductor and Intel and Hewlett-Packard to be these entrepreneurial free market companies that are doing their own thing. So that holding those two things together is part of understanding the American technological ecosystem. It isn't a top-down, President Eisenhower, President Kennedy says, we shall build a science city in Silicon Valley. That never happened. Instead, it is a much more organic and unwieldy and messy process, but it is something that produces this extraordinary innovation ecosystem. And you cannot, there would be no Silicon Valley had you not had this big government funding during the Cold War, and almost all of it military related. So then where do we get the anti-government culture of Silicon Valley that believes they did it all on their own? Well, part of it has to do with the structure of this, where a lot of this funding did come indirectly through private sector companies, through contracts to companies, so that you could work for a Hewlett-Packard or Fairchild Semiconductor, and you could have a book of business that was commercial and part of it that was federal, and you really didn't see yourself as a defense contractor or certainly not as a government employee, and you weren't. And the anti-government culture, of course, does come through in this founding generation, not just Hewlett and Packard, but also other people like Bob Noyce and the other founders of Intel, who were, not socially conservative, but were certainly fiscal conservatives, and they weren't big fans of big government. They understood that it was kind of their patriotic duty to do work with the government. They framed it as such, but they were no fans of big social programs or that sort of thing. So there's a little bit of that small government ethos that's already baked in. But it's the generation after this first generation that really takes it and molds it into closer to its modern form. The baby boom generation, the Vietnam generation, the students who, at Stanford and Berkeley in the late 1960s who were protesting the American war in Vietnam, who see and who are coming into a world, particularly for an engineering student, where computers are almost all the province of the military-industrial complex. And they would like to see something different. They see computation and computers as this immensely powerful tool. They are playing around with how do you subvert the establishment. They are thinking in terms along the lines of the Whole Earth Catalog, which was the famous countercultural magazine publication created by Stuart Brand in Palo Alto in the late 1960s, which Steve Jobs later referred to as Google before there was Google, kind of this compendium of all these different things. But this is the foreword of the first edition of the Whole Earth Catalog, which comes out in the fall of 1968. The purpose, we are as gods, and we might as well get used to it. So far, remotely done power and glory, as via government, big business, formal education, church, has succeeded to the point where gross, obscure, actual gains. In response to this dilemma and to these gains, a realm of intimate, personal power is developing. The power of the individual to conduct his own education, find his own inspiration, shape his own environment, and share his adventure with whomever is interested. Tools that aid this process are sought and promoted by the Whole Earth Catalog. Now, the Whole Earth Catalog wasn't a catalog like the Sears catalog or another catalog where you could actually order things from it. But it was a compendium of different goods that could be ordered, and with instructions on where to, send your check. It was everything from Buckminster Fuller books to kind of fringed countercultural hippie jackets, to scientific calculators manufactured by Hewlett Packard. It was this strange compendium that included in it were these tools, these digital tools for calculation and computation, saying we can take these computing machines away from the military industrial complex and put them in the hands of individuals and make them tools of individual empowerment. In the late 60s and early 70s, in the Bay Area and also all other places in North America, including here, there are communities of personal computer, let's call it evangelists. Personal computation was a movement before it was actually an industry, of young people who are playing around with how do you find distributed computer power? How do you miniaturize it so that people can control these machines, and also how they can communicate with one another via these machines? This is a very early electronic bulletin board that was set up in a coffee shop in Berkeley, California, right next to the University of California, called Community Memory. And essentially you could go and it was an electronic bulletin board like you would find in a coffee shop. If you wanted to, sell your guitar or find a pet sitter, you could go there and send messages to one another. And this is playing around with how can computers be personal devices. By the end of the 1970s, this movement has morphed into a nascent industry that these young men tinkering in garages, once again, are playing around and building machines that can sit on a desktop. And they are being heralded as tools of personal empowerment in very glorified terms. InfoWorld, which was a Palo Alto-based or Silicon Valley-based trade newsletter about what was then called microcomputing, desktop computing, had an editorial in April 1980 that began like this: "The personal computer represents the last chance for that relic of the American Revolution, our continent's major contribution to human civilization, the entrepreneur. The personal computer operator is the electronic man on horseback riding into the sinking western sun. He is the last of the rugged individualists, and the personal computer is his only effective weapon." So this hyper-individualism of computer as tool of a personal empowerment, of individual becoming your best self, your highest self through a computer on your desk, is something that is amplified by the young computer industry. In the words of entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs, who were in ad copy and in his speeches in the early years of Apple, refers to the computer as a bicycle for the mind. Isn't that a wonderful metaphor and so evocative? Think about it. Even if you know nothing about a computer, again, people like Jobs are trying to convince people to spend thousands of dollars on something they don't know they need. But if you think of a computer as something that isn't mysterious, that isn't something that's in the back room of some Fortune 50 company, but is something that is like a bicycle for the mind. If you got on a bicycle and you rode across campus, you would get much faster to where you're going than if you were walking, but you're powering it entirely by yourself. It's you making it go. And that was something that Apple marketed very effectively. When you get to user-friendly machines like the Macintosh, released in 1984, and here's Steve looking like Steve, looking like a new style CEO with the Mac in 1984, that it is something that is more accessible to everyone. It's a tool for writing. It's a tool for creation, not just a tool for calculation. It's a far cry from the giant mainframes that were developed 25 years before that to calculate missile trajectories for the US and the British military. It's a very, very different sentiment. And this idea of having something that's a tool of personal empowerment, again, is kind of antithetical to bureaucracy to governments, that the old ways of doing things no longer hold when you have a computer, and particularly when you're communicating by computer. And so this techno-libertarian sentiment, techno-optimistic and techno-libertarian, carries on into the early internet era, where you have people like John Perry Barlow, a co-founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, then and now an internet free speech organization and a very important lobbyist for kind of the rules of the road of the American internet. In 1996, writing another manifesto, a declaration of the independence of cyberspace, which begins, governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the home of the mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. We have no elected government, nor are we likely to have one. So I address you with no greater authority than that with which liberty itself always speaks. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any methods of enforcement we have true reason to fear. I think read that, which, by the way, Barlow wrote from Davos. He was at the World Economic Forum, and he wrote that at Davos, so it's inspired by being with captains of industry, I suppose. You read that, and somehow the current moment of Doge et al. Becomes more legible. Not justifiable, but more legible, that this has a deeper intellectual wellspring. And the contradictions inherent on it are manifest. Yes, indeed, cyberspace is new rules. It does challenge these old boundaries, political boundaries of nation states, of old ways of doing things, that old institutions do not naturally port and do not easily regulate this new world. But what is missing from manifestos like Barlow's, as well as manifestos like Mark Andreessen's later techno-optimist manifesto, is the fact that the federal government is foundational not simply to the microelectronics of Hewlett-Packard and Fairchild and others, but also to the communication network itself of the internet. The internet begins its life in the Pentagon, a US military project called the ARPANET in 1969. It is controlled is a government-owned system that by the 1980s has ported over to the National Science Foundation, but is still something only available for non-commercial use by government contractors and government grantees. So the commercial internet, that once it's commercialized, the backbone is opened up to other users and to buying and selling. But nonetheless, the infrastructure itself is something that the US government made happen and made possible, and also created rules of the road for governing its protocols. Everything from the addresses we type into web browsers to and on and on and on. So there is this dissonance. There is this not recognizing the government engine under the hood of the shiny sports car, so to speak. Part 3, the not so secret history of high-tech lobbying. Well, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are talking a very convincing and an important entrepreneurial game. Again, I'm not saying that what they didn't do to build these companies wasn't pretty extraordinary, and they were successful for a reason. There's a whole nother talk I can give about why some companies became market leaders and others did not. But they all, part of their success, they recognize, as any business does, that you have to have constructive relationships with the government. You need to have favorable policy environment, a favorable tax environment, regulatory environment. And so Silicon Valley leaders are regularly going to Washington, D.C. to lobby. Venture capitalists and electronics executives in the 1970s are going to Washington to lobby to lower the capital gains tax that they found was disincentivizing investment in high-tech industry. In the late 1970s, the semiconductor industry was greatly challenged by companies like Intel, were market leaders, but their dominance was being challenged by the growth of Japanese electronics, by Japanese competitors that were developing equally, if not more sophisticated chips and bringing them to market at a lower price. A competition that was so fierce that it sent California chip makers to petition the Reagan administration again and again and again and again throughout the 1980s for some sort of trade protectionism, and helps by the second Reagan term triggers Reagan imposing 100% tariffs on Japanese goods. See, tariffs, what's old is new again. Retaliatory sanctions aimed $300 million in electronics products and semiconductor disputes. So among the many different dimensions of Japanese-US competition in the 1980s, semiconductors and advanced semiconductors were a very important part of it. This is one example, one of many examples of very active high-tech lobbying by people who still were not big fans of big government, but recognized the important role that government as a regulator and a customer played. So too, another moment in a kind of a less known moment in the early 1980s as the personal computer industry is taking off. And Apple itself was deeply challenged by IBM bringing a personal computer to market. Some of you might remember those ubiquitous for a while Charlie Chaplin ads, or an actor dressed like the little tramp playing with a desktop computer that IBM ran on and on and on throughout North America in the early 1980s. This was a real challenge to Apple, and as a way to try and shore up its market position, it made a big play to put computers in schools. And in fact, in 1982, Steve Jobs went to Washington, D.C. for 2 whole weeks to lobby Congress for a special tax break that would allow computers to incentivize school districts to bring computers into schools. That would be a big boon to Apple that was going hard for this educational market. That did not pan out. Although Jobs later was successful in helping pass a California law that subsidized computers in schools and brought Apples into the classroom for California students. That's one reason that a lot of the Gen Xers, people my generation, the first computer that they encountered in a school setting or a college setting was Apple, which is very good, very smart marketing for the long term. But even with all that, with even this very hands-on lobbying that Jobs had done, going to the halls of Congress and going to offices to try and convince members, he still presented this very apolitical public image. And in fact, when a reporter asked him in 1984 who he was going to vote for president, he said, "I've never voted for a presidential candidate. I've never voted in my entire life." So this distance from the mess of politics, this seeming disinterest in government, and seeing government as something that was old and ossified and not relevant to the business of building the future was something that Silicon Valley entrepreneurs like Jobs and others really amplified. It became a very important part of the storytelling, and it fit into the moment. This is Reagan's America. This is when big government is indeed going out of style. And it was a narrative, a free market narrative that was amplified by political leaders, including Reagan himself. Towards the end of his presidency, in May 1988, Reagan went to Moscow. This is the era of Glasnost and Mikhail Gorbachev, this extraordinary visit that the Cold Warrior, the man who called the Soviet Union an evil empire 4 years before, goes to Moscow and, among other things, gives a speech at Moscow State University that remains my singular favorite image of any presidential speech ever. There we have Ronald Reagan under this giant bust of Lenin. His advance team had attempted to put a curtain over it, and the organizers had said, "Nope, you're gonna be right there." So he gives this extraordinary speech that is very, very much about what's going to happen after the Cold War ends. It's only 1988, but the writing is on the Berlin Wall, so to speak. And he says, "Standing here before a mural of your revolution, I want to talk about a very different revolution that is taking place right now. Its effects are peaceful, but they will fundamentally alter our world, shatter assumptions, and reshape our lives. It's easy to underestimate because it's not accompanied by banners or fanfare. It's been called the technological or information revolution, as at its emblem, one might take the tiny silicon chip, no bigger than a fingerprint." He continues, "The explorers of the modern era are entrepreneurs, men with vision, with the courage to take risks and faith enough to brave the unknown. These entrepreneurs and their small enterprises are responsible for almost all the economic growth in the United States. They are the prime movers of the technological revolution. In fact, one of the largest personal computer firms in the United States was started by 2 college students no older than you in the garage behind their home. I think he's talking here about Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, but there are a lot of garages. And then the kicker, and that's why it's so hard for government planners, no matter how sophisticated, to ever substitute for millions of individuals working night and day to make their dreams come true. The ultimate free market miracle is the technology industry of these guys in garages, of government leaving them alone and letting them be. I find this speech is a fantastic, rich text. and it's very interesting. Reagan's presidency, the time when he really talked about tech was when he was going overseas and talking to overseas audiences, especially to foreign students. Reagan's idea of the technology industry as this quintessentially American free market miracle that needed to be encouraged and nurtured, and a kind of an emblem for the future of the American economy, was something that was picked up by his successors, not just Republicans, but Democrats. And up until this point, Silicon Valley had been a very Republican place. There were very few out Democrats then, as someone I interviewed for my book explained to me. In 1980 and 1984, Reagan won Silicon Valley by a landslide. California was still a swing state, but it really trended red, and certainly in the Reagan era. But in 1992, and in fact, the year before he announced in 1991, Bill Clinton, Democratic governor of Arkansas, who had already positioned himself as a Democratic centrist, was flying out to Silicon Valley to woo its CEOs and its tech leaders to bring this very Republican place over to the Democratic side. That high tech was the sort of industry that centrist Democrats could get behind. If we're going to be pro-business, we're not going to be pro, polluting industries, oil and gas. We're going to be pro the future. We're going to be about these new companies with their cool young CEOs and these products that give us individual empowerment and new horizons. And so that wooing, that it also included choosing Al Gore, who was a real technophile and a leader in tech regulation and the commercialization of the internet, as his running mate, persuaded a group of Silicon Valley CEOs by the fall of 1992 to make the notable step of publicly endorsing the Democrat, which was not something that they had done before. As then chairman of Apple, John Sculley, said, "I'm still a Republican, but I am voting for Bill Clinton," because Clinton had persuaded them that his policies were going to be more Silicon Valley tech friendly than the Republicans. So this is an important thing to remember as we think about, look at what's happening to your South and the seeming rightward shift of Silicon Valley, that actually, first of all, it was Republican once before. And that part of the story here is about a industry that, like any other industry in Canada and the United States, you name it, is kind of going with the party that seems to be most favorable to their business and that is wooing them. And indeed, Clinton and Gore were quite good to the Valley. The Telecommunications Act of 1996, which created the rules of the road for the growth and the explosion of the internet, was something that was not, put regulations on some providers, telecom providers and others, and allowed this very big, smooth runway, lightly regulated runway for then young, scrappy internet companies to grow. And grow they did. And so by the end of the 1990s, you have this new set of entrepreneurial heroes gracing the cover of business magazines. You have Mark Andreessen, I think he's about 25 in this picture, the co-founder of Netscape, who is celebrated on the cover of Time magazine as a golden geek after his company goes public and sets off the dot-com boom on Wall Street. You have Jeff Bezos by 1999. What a goofy picture. There are lots of goofy 1990s pictures of Jeff Bezos. 1999's Person of the Year for Time magazine. And this love affair continues, and it's particularly pointed under Democratic leadership. The Obama administration was a time of very, very close ties between Washington, D.C. and Silicon Valley. And in fact, although people look today, right now with alarm at the outsized role and prominent and vocal support that some Silicon Valley leaders are giving Donald Trump, that actually it is a comparably loud and vocal and enthusiastic and embedded relationship was present at the beginning of the Obama administration. It was just a different time, a different moment. It was when social media and platforms like Facebook were seen as a good thing. Obama came to Silicon Valley a lot. A lot of Silicon Valley people came to Washington to work in the Obama administration. Companies like Facebook and Google were kind of a revolving door of personnel back and forth. And the narrative was mostly optimistic, not uniformly, but mostly. So in April 2011, which mind you is 14 years ago, that's not that long ago, when Barack Obama goes to Facebook to have a town hall with Mark Zuckerberg, the biggest buzz beforehand and the questions are not like, oh, is he going to quiz him about social media's, downstream effects on democracy? It was, is Barack going to wear a hoodie or is Mark going to wear a suit? It was fashion. And what they did was they started off wearing suit and tie, and then they very theatrically took their jackets off. And so the postmortems of the town hall were mostly about how they did the fashion. So it was different times. And this collective amnesia about the role that the federal government had played in the Valley and the continuing political relationships, notwithstanding the presidential visits to the Valley, which were more seen like one head of state coming to visit another head of state. There's this collective amnesia about the actual origins and the government origins of this whole entrepreneurial miracle. This is just someone put a silly large Post-it on a stairwell on Facebook, and I took a picture of it, so here we are. But Silicon Valley didn't invent the internet. The Pentagon did, Washington D.C. did. So there's this, this disconnect that has, become pervasive. So where does this get us now? Last and wrapping us up, the supersizing of Silicon Valley. So in some ways, what we're seeing now is a manifestation of trends that have been brewing for a very long time. But what makes it different now, in great part, has to do with how large and how powerful and how wealthy Silicon Valley has become, and how that wealth has become so concentrated in just a few enterprises. So this is a slide from Benedict Evans, who was actually a former partner at Andreessen Horowitz, who does really smart annual decks of analyses of the market. And this is from his deck from about 4 years ago, but I think it's a pretty good graph. Tech was very small until recently. The last dot on this graph here is Facebook founding in 2004. And look how just measured purely by the number of global computer users, how much that has increased. And smartphones, of course, have been a very significant increase in that. But this isn't just a story of tech getting bigger and software eating the world. This is also one of a few companies growing significantly in their market share, really enormously over the last few years. And just in the last 5 years alone, this is just metastasized, exploded, as have the wealth of the people at the very top. Here, this is from 2021. This is just showing how much the personal fortunes of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk grew during the COVID-19 pandemic and during 2020. All told, the two men alone increased their net worth in 2020 by a staggering $200 billion, which was a sum greater than the gross domestic products of 139 countries. So this is part of how we, the tableau during Trump's inauguration was something that really sort of stunned people, seeing this, billionaires row, murderers row, people refer to it as various things. And I should note that the assemblage of great industrialists is not something that has precedent in American history. I did search to see if Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller showed up at William McKinley's inauguration. Nope, this is not a thing. This is not something that happens. You have politicians, you have political allies, you do not have this very public display of leaders of a particular industry. And so the question is raised, well, why are they there? Why now? Why is this, if we have had this long relationship for so long, why is this, and why this about face from such a long support of Democrats that included and extended into the 2016 cycle? And then after Trump's election in 2016, there was great alarm by some of these very same people about what Trump would do to their business and what it might mean for the country. And yet that alarm is no longer there. And so in explaining why, I think we have to look for reasons both economic and cultural, that are both systemic and personal, that are both business and personal. And partly it's because there has been such a concentration of wealth and influence and power in just a few companies, that the power of and the decisions and inclinations of these few individuals has such an outsized effect. For example, Mark Zuckerberg, who's portrayed here on the far end of the image with next to his wife, Priscilla, the corporate governance structure of Meta is such that really the company does nothing that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't want it to do. He has outsized control. It's a one-man show. And so, again, this was not something that we saw in the age of Dave Packard as Deputy Secretary of Defense. You didn't have this concentration of corporate power as such. And what's the business reason that's driving so much of this? Well, as this depiction of a large Google data center along the Columbia River in Oregon, near where I live, shows, I think AI explains a lot of it, and the competition among these companies and these men to be first. It's plain old business competition, and this is something where the stakes are very, very high, where it's being proclaimed by no less than Bill Gates, and he's not alone, saying the development is as fundamental as the creation of the microprocessor, the personal computer, the internet, and the mobile phone. This is the next big thing, as declared by those in charge of the next big thing. And they are backing up this rhetoric with a heck of a lot of spending. This is capital spending, capital expenditures by quarter of the 4 largest technology companies that is now totaling in the billions and is scheduled to go up even higher in 2025. And most of this expenditure has to do with AI infrastructure, meaning data centers, data infrastructure, very high-powered chips, and the energy and water required to make that all go. And so they are investing heavily and betting very, very big on it. Another very big bet has to do with crypto. That is something that was, like AI, kind of under threat by the regulatory regime of the Biden administration, that was going to be regulated like currency. And so it was seen as a there are some real business threats that were posed by the tougher regulatory stance of the Biden administration that the Trump era is promising to lift. And that is very high stakes and ultimately will translate into not just pure profit and wealth, but business dominance. But there's a cultural and personal factor here at work too. And I think about, here's our Mark Andreessen. He is our golden geek of 1996, but he also is the author of the Techno-Optimist Manifesto that I began with. And here, later on in the Techno-Optimist Manifesto, he talks about the enemy. We have enemies. Our enemies are not bad people, rather bad ideas. Our present society has been subjected to a mass demoralization campaign for 6 decades against technology and against life, under varying names like existential risk, sustainability, ESG, sustainable development goals, social responsibility, stakeholder capitalism, precautionary principle, trust and safety, tech ethics, risk management, degrowth, the limits of growth. This demoralization campaign is based on bad ideas of the past, zombie ideas, many derived from communism, disastrous then and now, that refuse to die. So investors and entrepreneurs and corporate leaders like Mark Andreessen, like Mark Zuckerberg, who recently lifted the content moderation policies in force at Facebook or Meta, they see this, they are understanding the efforts to regulate, the efforts to create more diverse and equitable workplaces. The pushback they've gotten from their own employees is something that is a threat to innovation, and that the government, as an enforcer of that, has been a threat to that. And so too, there are these individuals, it's not that they have necessarily radically changed their stripes. Someone like Jeff Bezos has always been kind of leaning libertarian. He moved Amazon to Seattle in part because we don't have a state income tax. And so we would pay less, his employees would pay less in state income tax. But in the Trump era has, presented himself as a more sharply partisan figure, in part because he is thinking in terms of not only the former CEO of Amazon, but he is the founder and head of Blue Origin, his space exploration company, which is in a fierce race with Elon Musk's SpaceX for contracts. But he also is the owner of the Washington Post, an ownership that was a albatross during the first Trump administration, where Trump criticized him harshly for the Post's anti-Trump stance. And so after keeping 12 years of mostly hands-off ownership, he intervened quite sharply in its editorial stance a few weeks ago, telling the Washington Post team that its opinion pages will be going to be writing every day in support and defense of two pillars, personal liberties and free markets. We'll cover other topics too, of course, but viewpoints opposing those pillars will be left to publish by others. So these interventions, these sharply, this new rightward swing, so to speak, this very public presentation, trotting out the tech leaders who had nearly all the people in this image had previously very publicly and very vociferously opposed Donald Trump and his policies. Nearly all these people have in the past given very generously to Democrats. Now, not all of these people have like switched from being leftists to being arch conservatives. They are business people who have often danced with the one that wanted to dance with them. And they are products of this history, this contradictory history in which government contracts and regulation are so important to the tech business, and their actions are reflecting that today. It matters what the Trump administration does on their business. But it also reflects this contradictory politics in which government is something to be overcome. The government is not as smart, it's not as wise, it doesn't move as fast. It needs to be reinvented, if not completely torn down, and then something new built up again. That tech will be ultimately prevail, and that tech is better, and tech is progress. But I want to leave you with a quote that I really like, written by someone who is of this world, a software programmer and writer and thinker named Ellen Ullman, who in an essay published at the height of the dot-com boom, observed the nature of software, that software is something that's never created new, but that the machine that is everywhere hailed as the very incarnation of the new, both hardware and software, had revealed itself to be not so new after all, but a series of skins, layer on layer, winding around the messy, evolving idea of the computing machine. Nothing is new. Even the future is the product of history. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Margaret. Really fascinating. So there were note cards passed out for those who wanted to ask questions. Right now, I only have one note card. So either you don't have questions or you didn't want to write them down. So I'll take these two, and then maybe what I'll do is we'll just open it up to the floor and have people ask questions. When you do ask questions, please try and make it a question and try and make it a relatively concise question, just so that we can keep the conversation flowing.
Then I'll repeat it back so that people listening can hear.
Great. So first question is, what are some historical examples that would point to how unchecked corporate power is broken? How could the enormous wealth in Silicon Valley be reined in? A useful question for us to contemplate. So thanks to whoever wrote that one.
Yes, we do have historical examples. Well, the United States went through a somewhat similar moment in the late 19th century with the growth of new high-tech industries. In that case, it was railroads and steel and oil, using new technologies, new forms of organization, corporate organization, and financialization, including mergers and acquisitions that created vast combinations and trusts. And that got to a point where it was hobbling markets to such a degree and limiting consumer choice and driving up prices that what was then a much smaller U.S. government stepped in gradually, incrementally, and eventually with some of the regulatory measures and antitrust enforcement and statutes that still are enforced today. So the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, which today is the kind of a major regulator of companies like Meta and Google, came into being during the Woodrow Wilson administration in 1913. So too, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which is kind of beefed up and given some real teeth in the early 20th century, is something that is enforced during the Teddy Roosevelt administration and the administration of William Howard Taft. So there have been, I think that when you do, part of the techlash, so to speak, of the last decade has in part been simply because of size, that when you get to a certain, companies get to a certain size, there is a pushback against it. And look, there was not, I think in a way the US government was building things out of whole cloth in the 19th and early 20th century. Now there is an existing infrastructure and there have been choices not to enforce. And so part of this is turning on things and putting some muscle behind existing enforcement mechanisms. But some of it will have to do with actually thinking more creatively about what regulation looks like. And but I'm a, you know, I see antitrust enforcement, the putting guardrails around large companies, not necessarily always breaking them up, but putting some rules on what sandboxes they can play in, has been really constructive in the past. So one example I bring up is the case of AT&T, which in the 19-teens was allowed to be America's regulated monopoly of telephone provider, provided that it sold off its telegraph service and didn't get into any sort of other communication business. And by the 1940s, it really, really, really wants to get into computing in some kind of way, really wants to, it's always, and it's making so much money and has this remarkable industrial lab, Bell Labs. It's producing all these wonderful devices, including in 1947, the transistor itself. And, but a consent decree imposed by the US Department of Justice in 1956 requires AT&T to license that transistor technology for free, and then successive technologies for cheap. And so that, my friends, is why you have silicon semiconductor technology that is in Silicon Valley in the first place, because they were allowed to, startup companies like first Shockley and then Fairchild were allowed to use that foundational technology. So that's something that you know, regulation can be slippery, can be hard when a fast moving technology kind of outpaces the efforts to constrain it. But there are mechanisms and there is precedent. There just needs to be political will.
One thing that occurs to me just as kind of a follow-up to that is, you know, when you were showing the picture of all of the tech billionaires at Trump's inauguration, in your case, it was presented as a sort of a way to make sure that their sense of this growing market in AI would be one that they would be best poised to take advantage of. But I wonder if in the context of a backlash against tech, they're also in that room because they need to shore up their role against that kind of backlash. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think, you know, there's also this dimension of, you know, political gamesmanship in the Trump administration that is not something that's holds for other political leaders, which is that his retribution is personal. You see someone like Mark Zuckerberg who saw the real, you know, again, and Bezos too, these very, very personal attacks by Trump himself, and that having an effect on their market position and being a threat to not only themselves, but their business. I think there's also a dimension of anyone who is a kind of enemy of Trump attracts a great deal, you know, there are varying degrees of online and in real life threats that one attracts. And I don't have any inside knowledge into what these men are facing, but one can't, you know, take that completely off the table. So they're trying to position themselves and their business in its most favorable way possible. And I think also, you know, going to sort of Zuckerberg and content moderation, I think there's also this, you know, feeling like, okay, I was called in front of Congress and I did all these things and I, you know, made all these efforts and spent this money on content moderation and you're still mad at me. And so, well, forget it. I'm going to just, you know, forge ahead and do something else. So that's you know, there's an interesting, again, so much of the politics is hyper personal, which is greatly frustrating for the rest of us, you know, however many 7 billion people on the planet. But it is, you know, we are talking about a kind of concentration of power and governance in very few hands.
So next question from the audience says, what are your thoughts about the dark Enlightenment philosophy and Musk's declaration that compassion is a problem in democracy?
The dark Enlightenment philosophy. Well, I'll try to, I don't know if I'm going to do justice to sort of the TLDR on that, but essentially, I think it is a kind of anti-democratic, pro-monarchical notion, and a notion that in a way is taking the Silicon Valley's long fascination and fetishization of smart people thinking smart thoughts and who are better equipped to, you know, we should be led by the people who know something rather than the unwashed and uneducated masses, and best be educated, led by highly educated and skilled entrepreneurs and engineer entrepreneurs. And that this is all kind of, that you essentially, you need to tear everything down in order to build something up new. And that tech rules above all. that this is, that the technological solution is ultimately better than the bureaucratic solution. The private sector-led solution, the market-led solution is ultimately better than the state-regulated solution. It is better for at the individual level and the collective level. I'm not saying this is, evidence-based reasoning. I think it is, but it is I think what it does reflect is there are some, intellectual lights and self-styled philosophers that Curtis Yarvin is kind of the person very closely associated with dark enlightenment, a blogger who went by Mencius Moldbug for quite some time. These circles he's read, and these ideas are amplified, and they kind of fit in with this, again, in some ways we are dealing with this is not to say, I'm not here to absolve anyone of responsibility, but we have a group of people many of whom came into great wealth and great fame at a very young age, and were told, because they were very good extremely good at one thing, and they were told, you're one thing actually, because you're so good at that one thing is the most important thing, engineering. And your type of thinking is what society needs. And what are your thoughts on this, that, and the other? If everything could be, if we could, run everything like Silicon Valley, gosh, we'd be so much better off. And that is indeed a very prevailing discourse of the early Obama presidency. It was something that was not the idea of more Silicon Valley thinking is better for Washington, D.C. was something that was widely accepted and very, affirmatively embraced on the left and the center left. And so when you've had all that positive reinforcement, and then you also kind of enter middle age, even richer, and you have people kind of complaining about what you see as, well, I've been just out here building something and it's been so successful, and now you're penalizing me for my success. There's a lot of quoting of the Teddy Roosevelt man in the arena speech, the idea that I'm the one in the arena doing things, and the people on the sidelines, the armchair quarterbacks, so to speak, what did they build today? And that defensiveness is something that comes through, and when we listen to a lot of these people talk and think. So I don't know if that really answers the question, other than I think it is a reflection of this strange groupthink that is in some ways this, 2 decades of telling these folks they're fabulous, and then the world turned on them, and the markets have rewarded them even as the world turned on them too. I think there's this dissonance between the success of their businesses and the way that the media and some politicians and employees and pointy head academics have been complaining about them.
I want to thank all of you for writing so neatly on your cards. I was slightly worried about having to read people's handwriting, but you've done a lovely job. So next question says, how do you interpret the intervention of Musk in Germany's elections? Is there a historical precedent of tech industrial power endorsing roles for foreign political parties?
Not in the Silicon Valley context, and not at this scale. Is there, there really isn't. And in fact, the kind of overt endorsement and kind of messing with politics is something that's new. All of this lobbying and all of this kind of relationship that I described in my talk, notwithstanding, that was done kind of quietly behind the scenes. I mean, it was not, you did not have, yes, you had the group of CEOs endorsing Clinton in 1992, but that was still kind of an anodyne, something akin to other sorts of business endorsements, other industries endorsing candidates. It was not something where you have individuals kind of going in, and I think this is also something that is a relatively new phenomenon. While there have been very notable, famous American tech leaders, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, people knew their faces and their names. The kind of outsized celebrity of people like Elon Musk, and also of investors like Mark Andreessen, or the various investors, venture capitalists who have very popular podcasts, like this kind of level of individual celebrity, and I endorse this person. and endorsing on a very personal level rather than I think that this is good for my industry or I think this is good for my company. That is unusual and certainly messing in. I would love if someone could remind me of an example I'm forgetting, but I really do not have a good comp for you for let's, you know, let's weigh in on the foreign affairs, especially of countries of which one has never been a resident or nor a native.
I mean, it just seems to speak to the scale of the platform that
Yeah.
these billionaires now sit on, right?
Yes.
That they feel that they have something to say about the world
Yeah.
on the whole and have
Yeah.
the power to act on that.
That's right. That's right. And the supersizing of the valley of the tech industry is something that's notable. And it's something that really only kind of, I mean, it first kind of really came home to me as I was putting together the code and at my editor's wise insistence, bringing it up to what was then the present day, which was the day I turned in my manuscript in August 2018. But really seeing how much the 21st century tech industry was just so many orders of magnitude larger and richer and more influential because the platforms themselves go into so many other different domains. They're so influential in so many other businesses.
And yet the chart that you showed at the end suggests that at the close of the period of your book up till now, that has exploded.
I
all the
know,
more.
all the more.
Yeah.
I know.
All right, next question. What is your opinion and response to Yanis Varoufakis's concept of the development of techno-feudalism, which is the replacement of the market system and democracy with a system dominated by high-tech corporations? What is your prediction about the industry's effect on democracy?
Oh gosh, what is my prediction on techno-feudalism?
Or maybe just speak in general about the relationship between
Yeah.
these companies and democracy.
Yeah, well, there is, one of the things is that there is that I find concerning is that there's an understanding of history and politics that actually isn't a very broad and deeply rooted understanding of history and politics. It's kind of an understanding that's in service to the ideas you want it to be in service to. And the notion that, well, what would really work well is if you just carved up territory away from nation states and allowed certain entrepreneurs and companies just to rule it. Again, that's taking ideas that have been kind of in this pretty fringy intellectual sphere for about 15 years or so. Notions that have kind of manifested in techno-utopian projects like seasteading, which was to build basically a utopian separate society on the high seas outside the realm of nation states, or in a more kind of executed more firmly in kind of the ideas that inspired PayPal itself, the payments company that Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and many other key figures in this new tech hierarchy had a role in and were first enriched by, which is PayPal is about, escaping fiat currency, having an alternative way of payment that's electronic. And so too is cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. I think that we are, well, we moved past the old feudalism for a reason. And so, and perhaps this is me being a cockeyed optimist, but there is something fantastical about some of these ideas that does go against and kind of overstates the level of popular support that they might have. And I think this is perhaps a reflection of the very, I refer to the, Silicon Valley as kind of the uber wealthy as its own tech bubble. It's its own sort of, it can be a very insular community with a belief system that believes that, well, we can make this happen, and not really discounting that as hobbled as American democracy is, and as imperfect as it always has been, and particularly challenged as it is at present, it still is a democracy, and there is and that one does need to have popular support for things.
Well, people tend to be relatively attached to democracy. I don't think we're at a point where we're sort of absolutely ready to give it up. I mean, the Sidewalk Labs example that you started off with is a great example.
Yeah. And I think and it's very useful to kind of remember that these experiments haven't worked. And what are the things that have, and also remember that there can be very, and sometimes seemingly hyper-local things that move the needle. So Sidewalk Labs is a great example. Obviously, this is a very significant local story here, but it was still a local, this was a local story. And it's something where local power asserted itself and very effectively. And that's also, I think, the thing that is very challenging right now, certainly, that American politics itself has been nationalized, and that in a way that can obscure the power that lies in American federalism, which is still, yes, we have a great deal of executive power and it's being asserted aggressively, but there is a lot of, states and localities can do things in the American system and can stand in front of things. And also thinking more broadly and more globally about other nation states as countervailing, a sort of counterbalance to American hegemony.
I'll get to you. A question from online, which asks, you spoke of government regulation as a check on big tech power in the past and potentially now. Do you see organized worker movements playing any significant role as a countervailing measure?
I do, yes. I think, well, certainly historically, where, mass politics has been absolutely critical to the path of reform and the path of change, and certainly checks on corporate power. And, and worker movements have been critical to that. I think one of the questions that the labor movement in the United States and internationally has been grappling with over the last 20 years is that how does, the institutions formed in the industrial era port into the post-industrial era? And how do you, how is a landscape of gig work and contingent work, for example, and then other, shadow work and ghost work and global networks of labor, how can they be mobilized? And I think there's that remains the mitigating factor, but that does not mean, I think, I believe in the power of mass politics because I see so many historical examples of it, both, pushing in both all valences in a conservative and a liberal direction, in different contexts and different contingencies. And not saying this is, only privileges one side or the other. But yeah, I think that there is, and with every, although we can't say, well, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. It's not quite, but yet again, we do see shifts between, shifts in the aperture of the politically possible over time, and certainly, great disruptions that, it's interesting. COVID-19 could have been a disruption. Some read that in the United States as a disruption in favor of a more muscular welfare state and more government intervention after 4 decades of neoliberalism. And that actually in 2025, it looks from right now that the real kind of political disruption that caused was this new style populism and polarization, and even more distrust in public institutions. So it can go both ways, but I think yes, I believe in the power of mass politics and the smartly mobilized and effectively mobilized. Look, the labor movement is kind of, it was a few steps forward, a few steps back for over a long period, and then there's an extraordinary, power. It becomes an incredibly powerful force. And we get the weekend, among other things.
Just a quick point, following political science, that was terrific.
Thanks.
When you're doing the next edition,
Yes.
part of the story, the role of the U.S. state will surely be that just 2 years ago, Silicon Valley Bank failed.
Yes.
The state stepped in, second largest bailout in American history.
That's right.
Which is basically the state and the American taxpayer.
Yeah.
So at the essence of the system you're describing is one that socializes the losses and privatizes the gains.
Yes.
Nothing particularly new there.
Yeah.
It's kind of the essence of the system.
Yeah.
But I think that that part will go along with the continuing role of the state in this context.
Yeah.
And if one of the big platforms started to fail, you can imagine what will happen.
You can imagine.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think we have to imagine very much, right? We know that the system basically is a kind of version of very sophisticated socialism, not capitalism.
Yeah, I think that's a great, thank you for reminding me of Silicon Valley Bank, Luke, because it's been a long 2 years. That was only, that was only 2 springs ago when Silicon Valley Bank failed and there was a bailout and that's right. Like that these have, and that's the other thing. Like, this all moves fast. And a few years in American politics is a long time. And the winds can shift. And there is there is a life cycle to both these companies and the policies that support them and that subsidize them. I don't think that, the United States is going to give up its collective amnesia about the role that government plays in economic development. But the government has been playing this role since the days of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. It's how the United States grew. It was in this very privatized fashion, which is frustrating for the statists among us who want to be like, but we taxpayers paid for this. Don't give us credit. And the point about kind of the losses are the public bears the loss and the gains are privatized is a really important one. And that is certainly, the question of how much, when we actually sort of look at the genealogy, when we trace all the component parts of the iPhone that began with the with the U.S. government, the Pentagon in particular, you could argue that a great chunk of Apple's revenue needs to be ported over to the U.S. Treasury. I don't think that's going to happen, but it is worth remembering.
There's an argument that
Oh, microphone, yeah.
that in digital industries, it naturally leads to a monopoly.
Yeah,
In contrast to, let's say, the industrial era, where it is
Yeah.
an artificially created monopoly.
yes.
So does it mean that if that's the natural outcome, we will have this dominance, and therefore the state or the government accepts it? So there's no will to break it. That's the natural order of things in digital industries.
Yeah,
What do you think
yeah.
about
Well, that's certainly, the idea that 0 to 1 is the natural order of things. That's the Thielian, pro-monopolist position, and that it's the most, in a way, taking over the idea that animated universal telephone service in the early 20th century. Like certain goods need to be provided universally, and that this is the Facebook argument. You take your social web everywhere you go. And I think it overstates the novelty and the specialness of digital technologies. They are special in that they're able to produce extraordinary profits. One thing that's very interesting is and that I think is worth mentioning. It's kind of orthogonal to your very good point here, but I think it merits this era of kind of platform growth and monopolization of markets also occurred simultaneous with the zero interest rate era, ZIRP era, when it was free to borrow money, which juiced the stock market, which has been this period of extraordinary growth of the S&P 500, of the U.S. stock market. And so much of what's been happening, both the net worth of individuals like Elon Musk, and the cash on hand that these companies, the ability of companies to kind of further enrich themselves by stock buybacks, and that they then are spending on capital expenditures for AI infrastructure, for example, is all predicated on the stock market continuing to go gangbusters. And it's had this extraordinary bull market for so long, which at the moment is, well, we'll see. I mean, the tariff regime, and again, 19th century historians can tell you better than me. U.S. tried tariffs. It worked to a point, and it did not work at all. So, I mean, historians of the Great Depression can tell us that tariffs did not work at all. So I think it's going to be, I'm not saying I'm, oh, just wait till the stock market goes down, but it's very interesting how much stock value has been, market value, market cap is so central to this story of wealth. This is, ephemeral wealth in some ways because it's so tied to stock price.
distinction economists would make
Mm-hmm.
is digital industries follow the law of increasing returns and old industries follow the law of diminishing returns.
Yes.
Which is why these big 7 tech companies are just kind of
Increasing, yeah. Yes, because the capital expenditures, you can keep on getting, software, you get a good hockey stick growth with software, defies the laws.
We are, it's 6 o'clock. This session is supposed to go until 6, so I'm going to stop us here. So please join me very much in thanking Margaret O'Mara for coming and speaking with us today.
Thank you.